The Story of Russia with Orlando Figes. I'm Professor Saul David and I'm going to be your host for this evening. And before I introduce Orlando, just a little bit of housekeeping. You can make the video full screen by clicking on the square at the bottom right, and you can submit questions if you scroll down to the Q&A box, and these will be fed through to me and I'll deal with them at the end of the talk. I'm delighted to introduce our speaker, Orlando Figes. He's just informed me, former Professor of History at Birkbeck University of London, now Emeritus Professor. Only the most special academics get that accolade. But he's also, of course, and the reason we're here tonight, is one of the leading experts in the history of Russia. He's written many prize-winning, best-selling books, including, I'm sure many of you will have read them, A People's Tragedy, Natasha's Dance, which, by the way, is the reason my daughter's called Natasha. I might explain that later to Orlando. And now, of course, The Story of Russia. Reviewed in the Telegraph to not overwhelming praise, but I can assure you, having read the book and also having seen a number of other reviews, that this is a terrific book. If you need to understand what's going on in Russia and, of course, the conflict with Ukraine, you must buy this book, and I'll tell you how at the end of the talk. But let's get on with the questions to Orlando. Orlando, you start the book with the unveiling in Moscow in 2016 of the monument to Grand Prince Vladimir, different name in Ukraine, as you might mention, the ruler of Kievan Rus, the first Russian state, as the Russians believe, between 980 and 1015. Why is that event so significant?
Well, I wanted to start with that event because the conflict between Russia and Ukraine over who is the true descendant of Rus, or Kievan Rus, this first Russian state, it seemed to me at a moment of growing tension when I started to think about doing this book. And actually, that was my main aim in the book, to try to explain to the Western readers in a readable, concise, hopefully enjoyable history of Russia over 1,000 years, why and how it is that the Russians see their history so differently from the way we see it. So it's a book as much about the sort of national memory, about the mythologies of the past that are used by the state, dictatorship in this case, and we need to understand that if we're going to deal with Russia today. So this is a really good example of that, because on National Unity Day, November 4, 2016, as you say, just in front of the Kremlin, this hideous Russian kitsch, ginormous statue of Grand Prince Vladimir was unveiled. And Putin made this speech saying that the foundation of Kievan Rus was the beginning of the modern Russian state. And then the Patriarch Kirill came on and said that Christianity was the unifying force of the Russian state, which included Ukraine and Belarus. And this had come only 2 years after the Russian annexation of Crimea, which was particularly important in the story of Grand Prince Vladimir, because he had been baptized in the Crimea in a place called Chersonesos, which was an old Greek settlement there. And in doing so, converted the Russian population to Christianity. So it was the foundation of the modern Russian state and the foundation of its spiritual life. The two sides, if you like, of Byzantium, which Russia entered when it joined the family of Christian nations in 988 by that conversion. But of course, that is all part of the modern Russian mythology, that this is the origins of Russia, and our Russia includes the little Russians, as Putin would call the Ukrainians in that imperial discourse, or the white Russians, all part of the same Russian nation in Putin's mythology. But the Ukrainians were furious because, apart from anything, they had their own statue to the Grand Prince Vladimir, which had been put up in 1853. And although at that point Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire, it nonetheless became, in the later 19th century, a focus for feelings of national autonomy, of some sort of difference that Ukrainians had, or some regional identity at the very least. And so when that statue went up, Pyotr Poroshenko, the Ukrainian president at that time, sort of got quite angry about it and said, no, Ukraine did not enter Russia when Grand Prince Vladimir entered Christianity. His conversion to Christianity, says Poroshenko, was the moment that the Ukrainian nation became European. And indeed, later on, Ukraine was to be part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It was Western Ukraine to take a separate path. But of course, a lot of Eastern Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire. So you can see here there are two competing nationalist mythologies. The Putinite mythology that Russia and Ukraine are the same, and the Ukrainian nationalist mythology that we have a nationhood, and indeed a statehood, going all the way back to the first millennium.
You note in the introduction that no other country has imagined its past so frequently, and that history in Russia is political. It's a simple question to a big answer, I know, but as pithily as possible, what do you mean by that, and how relevant is it today?
Oh, absolutely relevant today. I mean, my point really is that in the absence of a fully functioning democracy or any common language for political discourse, there's no agreed notion of what democracy is or what freedom is, or there are no, in the absence of all of the normal political lexicon, the Russians have always looked to the past. So if you take the most famous of all disputes in Russian history between the Westernizers, who identified with Peter the Great's reforms from the 18th century to bring Russia into Europe and modernize Russia on Western lines, and the Slavophiles, who thought that was a terrible mistake because it meant denuding Russia's own national character. They forgot how to be themselves by copying the Europeans. That debate dominated the 19th century, but it's all about history. Did we take the right turn or the wrong turn under Peter? So history serves as a sort of vehicle for ideas about politics, about what Russia is. And that is particularly clear now because Putin would justify this war historically. He would say that, basically Russia was robbed of its Ukrainian lands by first the formation of the Soviet Union and then Ukrainian independence in 1991. And that actually Ukraine should be reincorporated into Russia. Well, that's all about his historical mythology. And his use of history is broader than that because he's been preparing the population for this war historically for some time. I would argue that the way Putin has used history for ideological purposes began right at the start of his presidency. I put it in the book in the last chapter that this was a poster I remember seeing when stuck in traffic jams, as I always was in Moscow, because there's just this boom of traffic at in the early noughties, and it was 2003, and I was looking at this massive poster for the United Russia Party, which was Putin's sort of rump party. It wasn't a real party, but it served its purposes in the parliament. And the poster was a map of the whole of Russia with 149 figures from Russian history in it. And there was everybody. There was Alexander Nevsky, this great medieval prince who'd repelled the Teutonic Knights. There was Alexander I, who'd repelled Napoleon. And there was Lenin. There was also, surprisingly, Stalin. Mm. So it was like a statement to say, as Russians, we must be proud of all of our history. And that was the basis of both the patriotic pride he wanted to instill in the Russians, the military spirit, and the sense that Russia should not take lectures from the West anymore.
There's a really astonishing statistic quite early on in the book, which I'm going to give now, which is that the Russian Empire grew at a rate of 130 square kilometers per day between 1500 and the revolution in 1917. Why did it need to grow at such a pace? And does this inform a little bit the sort of mindset in Russia today? This need, frankly, to surround yourself almost with a buffer zone of protection. What was going on? Why was it so necessary for the Russian state to grow at that rate?
Well, it grew at that rate because it could, because with gunpowder and muskets, they were easily able to subjugate the tribes of Siberia, even by just small mercenary units like the Cossacks who went out fur trapping. And so they could subjugate the population, take hostages, which is how they controlled the area. They would take hostages, incarcerate them, and then take tribute from the local tribes. They could do it because they could. Whether that means that Russia is by nature an expansionist state is a matter of how you see Russian history. Sure, there are those who'd say it is by definition expansionist. So that's an idea that became very popular in the 19th century. The Marquis de Custine wrote a very Russophobic book based on his travels in which he essentially argued that. And in the early 19th century, it did look like Russia had expanded so fast, so quickly. Suddenly they had defeated Napoleon. We'd all taken the Russians to be virtually Asiatic savages until that point. I mean, that's to exaggerate, but that's how it was seen. So it was seen as a threatening state from the beginning of its arrival on the European scene with the defeat of Napoleon. But I think a more sophisticated way of looking at it is that, Russia it's colonized itself over a Eurasian steppe, and it doesn't really have any clear territorial boundaries. So on the south, this fault line between Orthodox Russia and the Muslim world, there's the Caucasus which they can't control, and then there's the Black Sea, where there are competing powers, the Ottomans for a long time. And they can't control the Black Sea because of the Ottomans, so that they're always vulnerable to they feel they're always vulnerable to invasion, and they need the warm sea port for obvious reasons. And in the West too, they've often been invaded from the West by the Poles, the Lithuanians, the Swedes. So there's a sense that, yes, they need to either have buffer states or keep neighbouring states weak in order to defend the territory they have. And that's also partly, I think, a function of just the size of Russia, that it's not got enough military servitors in particular to guard this huge territory. So it needs to control satellite states or keep neighbour states like the Ottomans in the 19th century, keep them weak in order to protect the core of Russia. That's the thinking. So it's either you see them as expansionist or you see them, I guess, as aggressively defensive.
Another of the key themes you identified quite early on is this subordination of the Russian people to the state, and we can still see it today. How did this all begin, and how to explain the fact that it has survived 400 years when you look at, I know it's very different, but you look at English history and you can see this gradual weakening of the reliance on the individual to state?
Well, again, it comes down to the size of the country, massive, but a small population. And so the original servitors of Grand Prince Vladimir or later princes and tsars were rewarded for their service by land, but they didn't have enough people to work it. So the peasants were always looking for better conditions, always on the move. And the landlords, with the help of the state, were trying to tie the population down. And eventually that leads to the imposition of serfdom, finally crystallized in the law code of 1649, but effectively the labor of the peasant was regarded by the state as the property of the landlord since about the 16th century at the very least. So essentially, serfdom then ties down the population, and those that aren't earned by the landlords are made into state peasants by the Tsar. And it's really a form of enslavement of the population. Indeed, in many ways, the position of the Russian serf was worse than the American slave. might not be politically correct to say that, but it's true, because the American slave only paid dues to his master, whereas the Russian serf paid dues to the master, and by the way, could be subjected to flogging and all the rest of it. But he also paid taxes to the state in the form of labour duties or military conscription. So that was the enslavement of the mass of the population. And then that law code of the 17th century also set very strictly legal definitions of the merchant class, the townsman, the aristocracy, and so on. So all of these estates became rigidified. So if you think about the towns and the development, I mean, already by the 17th century, most of Europe, you're having industries develop. And much of it done by people who are quite mobile, immigrants in many cases. That couldn't happen in Russia because only a certain tier of people was allowed to live in a town. And then on and above that, there were later racial categories. So, you know, Jews had to live in a Pale of Settlement, but that came much later under Catherine the Great in the 18th century. So you can see that essentially what you have in Russia is a very fixed, settled, or the state is using all its power to settle the population, and serfdom is the manifestation of that, which has, lasts until the middle of the 19th century, but still continues in the mindset in many ways in many peasants. And then they have the freedom. The revolution gives them freedom, but already by 1928-29 they're being forced back into collective farms, which the peasants call a second serfdom. And then there's passport controls and people's ability to move in the country. You were only registered to be able to be in a city like Moscow or Leningrad, as it was then called, if you had that stated in your passport. So if you were stopped on the street and you weren't where you're supposed to be, you could be in deep trouble. So this is the state mobilizing but controlling the population for its own purposes, to satisfy its servitors and to conscript for the army, which leaves very little room for the development of all those civil institutions we take for granted as part of our democracy. Yeah, I mean, a free aristocracy, a land-owning aristocracy. You don't have that in Russia. The aristocracy in Russia is given land, but only on condition that it serves the Tsar. If the boyar, the landlord, doesn't please the Tsar will take away his land. Well, I mean, I would say there's a similar relationship going on now between Putin and the oligarchs. If you do Putin's bidding, you'll keep your riches. If you cross him, you'll go straight to jail.
I mean, these are very particular conditions, the vastness of the terrain, the smallness, comparatively speaking, of the population, that are hindrances to the sort of development that you can see in Western Europe, and only then in certain parts of Western Europe. So, historians have long argued that democracy and capitalism can only thrive in certain conditions, and it's no coincidence that the maritime powers, for example, like Holland and the United Kingdom, Great Britain, were the ones to have that first. But the other thing that's always fascinating, that as an aside, that is a sort of general comment aside, the other thing that's always fascinated me, and you've already touched on this, is this oscillation, even among the rulers of Russia, between Western-leaning and then this Slavophile reaction that there tends to be. So you've got Peter the Great, of course, and Catherine the Great, and the reaction is after their rule. I think you probably would put Nicholas I in the 19th century in the reaction camp, as it were. And of course, Putin is another Slavophile who's reacting against this Western influence, maybe Yeltsin. Why have we had that, and how costly has that been, I suppose, for Russia's development?
Well, I think it's partly the legacy of Peter the Great's reforms, which are incredibly divisive. And already by the 1740s and 50s, you have the beginnings of a Slavophile reaction. At first, in the field of language, they didn't like the introduction of a new, basically Latin script in Russia for printing, and wanted the continuation of Church Slavonic. They didn't like the import of neologisms from the West. They didn't like the loss of national character, which they felt all of this Westernization entailed. They saw it as a threat. But I think that there's something much deeper going on too, culturally, that since Peter the Great, Russian society and Russia's rulers, who count themselves in that westernizing project, have measured their success by how far they can catch up with the West. There's always been an awareness of Russia's backwardness, because it doesn't have, it does now, but it didn't then have vast resources to sell like the maritime powers had by, basically pillaging the Caribbean or India or whatever. They didn't have that. They had furs. And furs in the medieval period, Russian furs were highly prized in Europe. But otherwise they had timber, they had wax, they didn't have yet oil, gold, mineral, platinum, diamonds. They didn't have that yet. So essentially they were always aware that they were lagging behind, and yet at the same time that created, I think, culturally a sense of inferiority, superiority. Inferiority because, as Gertzen or Herzen, the great 19th century writer, put it, the Russians arrived in Europe like the provincials at a great metropolitan ball. They feel like they're not properly respected as Europeans, and that is still very much alive today. But on top of that, there's this slight reaction, which is a superiority complex. This is the Slavophile idea that we might be technologically backward compared to the West, but morally, spiritually, we are superior. This is the idea of the Russian soul. Why? Because Moscow is the third Rome. This is one of the basic mythologies of Russian history, which I'm afraid is still alive. This was the idea that after the fall of Rome and after the fall of Constantinople in 1453, Moscow, the Patriarch of Moscow, was the last true remaining seat of orthodoxy. Everything that happened in the Orthodox Church after that, in the Greek Church, for example, was just heresy because it was westernized. It had joined the papacy effectively in the Council of Florence. So Russian Orthodoxy gave to Russia and the Russian state, from about the time of Ivan IV, Ivan the Terrible, in the middle of the 16th century, this ideology, Moscow as the third Rome, that it had this mission to save the world through its superior Christianity. And that remains with it to this day, and it's been very instrumental in wars, in Russia's wars. So the first time Russia invaded Ukraine to side with the Cossacks fighting the Poles in the 1650s, it was Patriarch Nikon that argued for this, that it was an Orthodox holy war. When Nicholas I, you mentioned, went to war against all the Western powers in the Crimean War, as it became, it was to defend the Orthodox in the Ottoman Empire and in the Holy Lands, then still part of the Ottoman Empire. Likewise, Putin has gone to war against the whole of the West on the spurious grounds that Russia has this mission to defend Russian speakers, who are, said Putin in that famous speech when he called the collapse of the Soviet Union the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. He also said for Russia it was a great tragedy because so many tens of millions of our citizens, he said our citizens, found themselves after 1991 outside the territorial boundaries of the Russian Federation in places like Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan. So this Russian world concept he has is, again, Slavophile, anti-Western. We must stand up for our principles, our traditional values. He's been going on about all this time, these conservative Christian values he promotes as an antidote to Western liberalism and individualism. All of this is deeply rooted in historical mythology.
You mentioned the Crimean War. I mean, your book on Crimea, which I didn't mention in the introduction, but it really opened my eyes, as you say, to this religious, sort of almost spiritual element, almost a holy war that they were fighting, as you've already pointed out. But the consequences of that war were really quite profound, weren't they, Orlando? Because you say in the story of Russia, actually the humiliation felt by Russia after that war in terms of the incredibly harsh terms that were imposed upon Russia by the Treaty of Paris is still felt to this day.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, the Treaty of Paris was exceptionally harsh on Russia in that it basically forced them to destroy their naval base in Sevastopol.
Yeah. And
no one had ever done that to a great power before. You know, even when Napoleon was defeated, the French, you know, everyone was afraid of French revanchism, but no one told the French they couldn't have an army and you had to completely demilitarize. Well, that's what they did to Russia. And the Russians felt that as a great humiliation. I mean, luckily for them, I guess, the rise of Germany meant that, you know, the French quickly needed them. And so we see this rapprochement between Russia and France in the 1870s, and then the triple entente with Britain, because of the mutual fear of Germany. But yes, that sense that we are not treated with the respect we're due is very much part of this anti-Western nationalism that Putin spouts. And the other thing in the Crimean War that I think is, again, very, very relevant today is that in the arguments deployed by the Pan-Slav thinkers who pushed Nicholas towards war in 1853, there's a really revealing memorandum by one of the leading Pan-Slavs, Mikhail Pogodin, a history professor, in which he writes to Nicholas I, you know, the Western powers, they're allowed to do what they like. The French can annex Algiers. The English can crush another Mughal kingdom and, you know, take another chunk of India. But when we want to defend our co-religionists in the Ottoman Empire, this is suddenly not allowed. And so this sense of double standards, of hypocrisy from the West, which we've heard so often from the Russians, you know, that again deeply rooted and goes back to that war, because there was this sense then that the Russians were never fully acknowledged as a great power, as a European power by Europe, and never given the respect that they merited.
We're going to have to move forward through events a little bit because, as you suggested, we've got 1,000 years to cover. But another amazing statistic in the book, and there are many, during the Second World War, Russia loses, I think, you know, give or take, it's disputed, up to 30 million civilians and soldiers. And yet, and here's the statistic, of all the 18-year-olds mobilized in 1941, and that's male and female, only 3% would still be alive in 1945.
Yes.
I mean, you've got a youth that are prepared to die for the cause of Russia. Explain that. I mean, why is this so significant? I mean, is it the youth who are buying into the idea and the slightly older guard who are not so willing, or is it just a general sacrifice? But this is a real outlier in terms of statistics.
No, it's not an outlier. I think you need to explain it by the cult of sacrifice that had been very, very cleverly developed by the Bolsheviks since 1917, particularly through their cult of the Civil War. The Bolsheviks had to fight against 14 Allied powers, several white anti-Bolshevik parties, and many smaller armies from 1917 until really 1921. And that example in which the Bolshevik dictatorship was forged, in which they learned to sort of rule by the gun coercively, civil war methods became Bolshevik methods. But that experience also was built, particularly by Stalin in the 1930s, into the cult of the military warrior hero, which reflected on him as the as the sort of patron of all military heroes from the people. So if you think of the cult of the Civil War, two classic texts, both books and films come out of it. The film of Chapayev. Chapayev was this Red Army soldier from the ordinary people who had fought against the Cossacks on the Orenburg steppe, and he'd been killed, so he was a martyr. And they made a film out of him which sort of was viewed by so many millions of people, mostly, you know, armies of school kids, all forced to see this. And it created this cult of the Bolshevik hero of the people, who is the patriotic soldier, which, you know, goes back through history. So the foundation of the Romanov dynasty was in another civil war, with the Swedes and the Poles also intervening. But the march of the foreigners on Moscow was halted by Susanin, this ordinary butcher who had from Nizhny Novgorod, who had organised the people to form a militia. So it's this idea of the people's hero that it then reflects on Stalin, and it creates in the generation just below that those who hadn't been in the Civil War, those who were born in the baby boom of the early 1920s after the First World War. By the time 1941 comes along, they're 18 years old, and they've been brought up on this cult. And they desperately want to emulate their older brothers and their fathers, and mothers for that matter, and throw themselves into the war effort. So that's why there was this, in 1941, there was this just torrent of university and even school children signing up for the army. But of course, the army in June 41 was in chaos. Many of them weren't even given guns or anything. And moreover, they didn't have any war experience. Some of them had cadet training in schools, but they didn't really know how to fight. And most importantly, they didn't know how to look after themselves. Older soldiers know how to look after themselves and not get killed needlessly. These kids just threw themselves into battle and were wiped out.
Moving a little bit closer to current times, we've just had the announcement, of course, last week of the death of Mikhail Gorbachev. Major figure in the West. Generally speaking, the obituaries have been pretty positive, but he's a much more ambivalent figure in Russia. Can you explain a little bit about why not all Russians were convinced by Gorbachev?
Yeah. Well, that's a big and complex question. I mean, essentially, the Russians at the time found perestroika, glasnost to be chaotic, and the experience of the 1990s reinforced that sense that this was just a collapse of everything they knew, a collapse of a state, an ideology, a system in which they had some securities. And it seemed to them that they weren't gaining anything out of this. So all of that experience cast a very dark, bad light on Gorbachev. But since then, I think Putin and the sort of manipulation of history that the regime has been involved in over the last 20 years has painted this idea that Russia is strong when it's united behind a strong leader. It's weak and collapses into civil war when it's led by liberals, in which Gorbachev must count, because liberals always fall under the influence of the West. Yeah. So Gorbachev essentially was essentially a puppet of the West, and he didn't bring improvements. He led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. So all of this, you know, is to give Gorbachev, unfortunately, a much undeserved reputation in Russia, because after all, he did give them freedom, and he did do something very, very important, which is that he oversaw the dismantling of the Soviet system without a civil war. And believe me, I mean, I was in Russia through the whole of that period. A civil war was very much on the cards. There was that feeling that this was only a little bit like America today, where it was that sort of, that you have two clear and mutually exclusive camps at war with each other already verbally, ideologically, and it would only be one step to that descending into violence. So I think Putin, I think Gorbachev deserves a huge amount of credit for that. But unfortunately, yeah, his image today, not great.
Okay, so we are now in 1991. The Soviet Union has collapsed. Individual countries, including Ukraine, are going their own way. In fact, of course, as I'm sure we'll come on to either in my questions to you, excuse me, or questions from the audience, I'm sure we'll come on to this. But what I'm intrigued to know, Orlando, is your opinion of whether opportunities were missed by the West in the 90s to somehow bring Yeltsin and Russia closer in alignment towards the West.
Well, I think anything I say has to be prefaced by the problem of 1991 itself in terms of Russia and Ukraine. Because, as you know, Ukraine was given Crimea by Khrushchev in 1954. And then there are other parts of Ukraine which have always been disputed by Russian nationalists. Indeed, in the 1990s, there was a powerful Russian irredentist movement behind the restoration to Russia of what they call New Russia. New Russia are those provinces now occupied in the south of Ukraine by the Russian forces, not the Crimea, but the littoral in the south of Ukraine, conquered by Catherine the Great, where Russian is the dominant language, and which was until 1917 not officially part of Ukraine, although Ukraine was broken up into provinces, but was called New Russia. So there was always an irredentist group of Russian nationalists who believed that the boundaries Ukraine had been given in 1991 were too big and they were at the expense of Russia. So I think that the current war is rooted in that. It's rooted in Putin's agreement with that position, because in a very important essay he wrote in July 2021 on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, as he called it, he argued there that, paraphrasing his great political mentor Sobchak and Solzhenitsyn, that if Ukraine was to join leave the Soviet Union, as it did in 1991, it should leave with what it entered with. In other words, not everything it had in 1991. And that is, I think, the beginning of the problem. Because in that little cohort of basically men turning 70, who are all senior military and KGB guys in 1991 and saw their bosses lose an empire, they had since then probably, but this war is very much with that aim in mind, wanted to take back what the Ukrainians had deprived them of. There's this sense of it's time for revenge. It's time to teach the Ukrainians a lesson. So from that point of view, there's probably very little that the West could have done. Having said that preface, obviously, I believe there are, I think that the general view in Russia now is that Yeltsin was a puppy of Clinton, that he would have lost the election of 1996 if it wasn't for American involvement and the loans to shares scheme, which created the oligarch class. And so that the whole caboodle of neoliberalism, privatization coming to Russia, this rampant corrupt capitalism, was sort of imposed on Russia by the West. That's the view, and that Yeltsin essentially took orders from Clinton. That's how it's seen. That's certainly how it's propagandized now, and consequently, there's this sense of sort of resentment. Which, well, how does one deal with that? I mean, NATO expansion. Yes, I can see that it's a provocation to Russia. I'm not alone in saying that. George Kennan, who was the architect of the Cold War containment policy, he argued that in 1997, that it would be a provocation to Russia to expand NATO into former Soviet satellite states like Czechoslovakia, etc., and that there would be a backlash as a result. Now, that's not to justify the backlash, far from it, but perhaps there could have been a better navigation of some geopolitical, some security arrangements that would have held possibly now NATO states in a sphere of neutrality like Finland had, something like that. I don't know. Now it's obviously too late for all of that. But I think it was badly handled, and the Russians felt that they weren't being listened to. Their point of view wasn't being listened to. And I can understand that, because after all, the East European states that join NATO, they're sovereign states. They can decide what they want to do. So there's that problem to get around as well. And, the Baltic states and Poland, they all have national memories of invasion, aggression from Russia. So you can hardly blame them for wanting to join NATO. So there's no simple answers to this. But sure, mistakes were made in the past. There's been a failure to misunderstand. So there's been a failure to understand the Russian point of view. Mm-hmm. And that's partly why I've written this book, because I want to be able to show both sides and how we've come to this.
My final question, because we must move on to the listeners or viewers' questions in a moment. But the final question is kind of double question. Given everything you've said about what Putin and his sort of this ex-security group at the top of Russian politics, the ex-KGB types, were thinking, and given what they'd already managed to get their hands on, which is Crimea and a big chunk of eastern Ukraine, why on earth do you make the decision to go all in and invade Russia in February of this year? First question. And second question is, how on earth is this all going to end? I mean, I know you can't answer that in any certainty, but what is your instinct about how it might end?
Well, your first is an excellent question, and we don't really know what the answer to that is. I mean, it does seem very odd, because everything was going Russia's way. They'd got away effectively with the annexation of Crimea. The sanctions were weak. They got the World Cup in 2018. So the West was deeply complicit in the Putin economy and system in many ways. So why go for an all-out invasion? It does seem very strange, and certainly the idea that they could take Kiev in a blitzkrieg was based on very bad intelligence. So it's hard to sort of get around whether this was a mistake, whether this was the result of Putin's hubris. I think he'd been very isolated during COVID. He had not really taken, he got himself into that position that many dictators get themselves into when they've been in power too long, is that they've surrounded themselves with people who just tell them what they want to hear. A warning to Liz Truss there, I think. And so there was nobody to challenge him. He was really like a tsar by this point. So it might have been hubris. But there's a nasty feeling in the back of my soul here that this war has been planned for a long time, and that they saw this as a window of opportunity. A, because economies are trying to recover from COVID, and B, because fossil fuel economies are going to be dinosaurs, hopefully, fairly soon. They are a fossil fuel economy. And so they wanted to weaponize that to do something useful for China, which is where Russia is now heading for its future, I believe. So, and that I think is its future, whatever the outcome of the war. Mm-hmm. Whatever the outcome of the war is, hard to say. But my instinct is that the Russians are winning this war, because they have 20% of Ukrainian territory under their occupation. And unfortunately, at any point, they can declare a victory, that they've got what they need, and invite negotiations. Mm-hmm. And then that puts Zelensky in a very, very difficult position, because I don't think many Ukrainians would support negotiations with the Russians. But negotiations with the Russians is the only way to stop the war, the killing, at least get a ceasefire. So there's going to be some very, very, very difficult decisions made, not just in Kiev, but also in Western capitals. Because, we're only entering the first winter of this war. And I'm not sure whether states can go more than one winter, forking out 100 billion to help people with their energy supplies. And it'll only be an amount of time, well, we've already seen it in Prague, massive demonstrations, before there are, demonstrations, hopefully not, but I fear extremist movements, populist parties and movements campaigning against the war. It may happen in Italy with the elections coming in September, with the neo-fascists coming back, and they will want to do a deal with Putin. So I fear very much that the West will be divided and the Ukrainians will be forced to the negotiating table, and none of the principles that the West is quite rightly supporting the Ukrainians for in this war will be upheld.
Okay, now the first question from the audience, and this is anonymous, links in very neatly, frankly, with what you've just been saying, because it's a question about your opinion about what else the West can do. Do you feel that the West's current strategy, that's obviously sanctions on the one hand and military support on the other, albeit not even among the various members even of NATO, will prove to be a meaningful deterrent, or should they be doing more?
More in terms of what? More
ratcheting up the sanctions and providing even more military support. And obviously some people are even going so far as to suggest we may get to a point where you impose a, let's say for the sake of argument, no-fly zone. You're almost getting NATO involved directly.
I think that would be very dangerous because I think it would escalate quickly.
Yeah.
I think that that the Russians have said quite clearly on several occasions that they will use tactical nuclear weapons. That's not the long-range missiles, that's stuff on the battlefield.
Yeah.
If there's an existential threat to Russia. Well, there have already been missiles hit Crimea, which for the Russians is Russia now. I mean, we might not recognize it, but it's been annexed. They've carried out a referendum. They see Crimea as Russia. So if there's a build-up of military attacks on Crimea, if the Ukrainians were to launch a successful counteroffensive and then with NATO weapons go into Crimea, then I think that would escalate quite quickly, unfortunately. Certainly if there were NATO troops on the ground, or if there were NATO aircraft enforcing a no-fly zone, then there would inevitably be an escalation quite quickly. And I'm afraid that we can't afford that. I mean, that's not an appeasement position, it's just a sane position, I think. So I think that the West really is limited, and when I say the West, it's really the Americans, to supporting the Ukrainians with the advanced missiles and systems to go with them, and as much arms and munitions as they can afford to give them and train them to use, to the point where the Ukrainians are in a position of strength to negotiate with the Russians.
I mean, there's a question here following on from that, actually, interestingly. Literally the next question, what is stopping Putin using his nuclear weapons? Well, you've already answered that. He doesn't need to use them, or at least he would be wise not to use them. It's the threat of using them that he can leverage, frankly, or discourage the West from getting directly involved. That's the key thing for him, isn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. And that threat has to be real. And in Soviet wargaming, the use of tactical nuclear weapons was never a sort of the card you never use. It was always thought of as the card you use when you have to. So I think that if the Putin regime was faced with military defeat, they would use tactical nuclear weapons. Yes, I believe they would.
Okay, this is optimistic, this question. Has Russia ever had, or is it ever likely to have, a democracy, or anything close to a democracy?
Well, it had the freest democracy in the world for 8 months in 1917. As a result of the overthrow of the monarchy and the glorious February Revolution. But that soon descended into civil war in the middle of a world war, and the Bolsheviks came to power and through civil war built their own dictatorship. There have been many other periods in Russian history when there have been popular rebellions, attempts by army officers, as in 1825, to impose a constitution on the monarchy. And there was a strong democratic movement in 1991, in the period of glasnost too. So it's not that the Russians are not they are freedom-loving. They do have a democratic instinct. In fact, the basic organizational unit of Russian society for hundreds of years, until the collectivization of agriculture, was the village commune. And the village commune was an egalitarian democratic system of self-rule. So it's not that the principle isn't there, it is. I think, in terms of how we understand the failure of democracy, it must be seen in terms of this just overpowering state, along with the weakness of society. The fact that you don't have a landowning aristocracy able to put down roots that will build all those things that we take for granted as the building blocks of democracy, like town councils and consumer societies and the church and its parish, all these things which we have in Western Europe from an independent aristocracy and an independent middle class. And these things have never really been allowed, precisely because of this sort of legal enslavement of the population, which we've been talking about. They've never really developed to the point where these institutions have evolved. They hadn't really evolved to the point in 1917 where they could properly defend themselves or stabilise more democratic forms of self-government against what for 1917 became the dominant struggle, which was a class struggle. So the Bolsheviks won in that situation.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions about Gorbachev, but I think you've answered them. I mean, one was, why didn't he get a state funeral? Well, you've already explained this ambivalence. He's unlikely to get the leaders of Russia today authorizing a state funeral. So I think we've dealt with that. Other question is, why does he have a poor reputation? Well, you've also dealt with that. Here's an interesting one, and you've dealt with this, but I feel you need to be more emphatic about this. Orlando, is there any historical or cultural justification for Putin's invasion of the Ukraine?
No, absolutely not. Of course not. Ukraine has been a fully sovereign, independent state since 1991. And Russia always accepted that. Putin himself accepted it only 2 years ago in various speeches he's made. In that article he wrote in July 2021, he says it's a sovereign state. It's welcome to have its sovereignty, just mustn't be turned into an anti-Russia, is what he argued. But that's the fact that you don't like your neighbour is no reason to go and beat the hell out of them and destroy their house. So that's what the Russians have done to the Ukrainians. There's no justification for that, obviously not. No.
There's a nice one here. I like the phrasing of this. How do you explain the brutality versus the brilliance of the Russian people? Yes, historically it has come from the top, but you covered so much in Natasha's dance, which also looked at the brilliance of the artists in all genres. Is there this dichotomy among them?
There is a dichotomy, and that's right at the heart of the conundrum that is Russia. Once, I don't know if you've read Milovan Djilas's Conversations with Stalin. He once was at a dinner with Stalin in 1944, and he was complaining to him about the mass rapes that Soviet soldiers were carrying out against the Yugoslav women. And Stalin said to him, "Have you ever read Dostoevsky?" Because, to understand the Russians, you need to have understood what Dostoevsky's on about. That there is this sort of chaotic violence which can spill over into complete irrationality and revolution and terrorism. And in the same person, there is this sort of sense of repentance, this sense of guilt, this sense of spirituality, which is the energy in Russian cultural expression. So it's this very potent and mercurial compound, the Russian soul, if we can call it that. Both those elements are there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm guessing, like a lot of Western writers of Russia, you're not going to be hugely welcomed in Moscow and Russia anytime soon, Orlando, particularly when the detail of your book is read. Now, of course, from our perspective, it's a sort of wonderfully objective portrait, but from the Russians' perspective, or at least those leading Russia at the moment, they're not going to be terribly happy about it, are they? But here's a question following on from that, is beyond Putin, I suppose what I was trying to get at is you obviously have a love of Russia. You kind of spent all those years, or love of Russian culture, love of the Russian soul, shall we say. So here's the question. Beyond Putin, are you optimistic about the future of Russia?
Well, I'm 62, so maybe I got 20 years left if I'm lucky. And I don't see any change in my lifetime. And I think that is the most depressing thing of all, really, that I feel terrible for younger people in Russia who oppose the war, who don't have a future there, because for them it's essentially going back to the Soviet system in a sort of late Brezhnev mode. So I can't raise hopes, even on my best days, to think that there might be a post-Putinite Russia. I don't see it at the moment. And I think we've had a flood of Russians leave Russia. I mean, we've had it for some time. I mean, we've had it since, a big exodus after the failure of the 2012 demonstrations and the beginning of Putin's third presidency. People got very depressed, thinking this is now the future for them. And I think that when it becomes possible, there'll be another flood of Russians leaving Russia, because I don't think, whatever the result of this war, I don't see the Putin regime changing, or even if Putin is replaced, the person who will replace him will be Putin too. It could be worse. I mean, it could be seriously worse, because the situation in Russia could be much worse. So it might be that they want a full return to totalitarianism, or it becomes some sort of fascist state. That's also possible. So I just, there will be another exodus, and I'm afraid the regime is here to stay. So it's a pretty bleak prospect, but there could be a revolution. You never know. We don't know. It's so hard to tell what's really going on in the country.
Okay, we've almost got to wrap it up. But final question, in the hope that you might be able to produce a little bit more optimism for Ukraine, can you imagine a scenario, and this is a question from one of our viewers, can you imagine a scenario where they are welcomed into the West, as it were, in terms of the EU or NATO? Is that a possibility in the future, do you think?
For Ukraine?
Yeah.
It has to win the war. That's what the war is about. The war for Russia is about locking Ukraine into the Russian sphere of influence.
That might be victory without getting all their territory back, as it were, might it?
Well, yeah, but that's been the case since 2014, because with the Russian annexation of Crimea and the occupation of the Donbass, or part of it since 2014, that's effectively barred the Ukrainians joining the EU or NATO. So that's already a victory for the Russians, I'm afraid, because as long as the Russians have boots on Ukrainian territory, they cannot be considered for membership of either Western institution. It may be that that Ukraine partitions, but we're talking about some very long period ahead, and that what we used to call, right bank Ukraine, in other words, west of the Dnieper, it is a fully independent state again, and can be integrated into Europe, and the rest is either in some sort of, Transnistria, Moldovan sort of dysfunctional status, or is incorporated in some way into Russia. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a terrible thing to think of, but I'm afraid that is one possible long-term outcome.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Orlando. I think that's all we have time for. Obviously, I'd like to thank Orlando for an absolutely fascinating discussion. I'd like to thank everyone who's watching for joining the event. Please know that if you weren't lucky enough to get one of those 75 books of Orlando's new volume, The Story of Russia, which were given out to people who were quick off the mark, you can, of course, buy it in all good bookshops and the Telegraph bookshop, of course, itself. Please keep an eye out on the Telegraph Extra website for more subscriber-exclusive events like this one. In fact, you might like to sign up for an online event with Lord Frost on the 15th of September to take a closer look, for a topical list, of course, given what's happened today, at our new Prime Minister with Christopher Chopper Hope. You're also going to be sent a questionnaire about, your thoughts on this evening. Please be kind to both of us. Hopefully you'll have Orlando's book by then and you'll be feeling even happier, because in 300 pages he has summarized 1,000 years of Russian history. It's an astonishing achievement, so please do buy that book. Thank you very much for joining us. Goodbye.
Thank you.